I came home from a work trip 2 days early and found my 9-year-old daughter on her knees scrubbing the kitchen floor in total silence. No supervision, no explanation, just punishment. My parents had taken their real granddaughter to an amusement park while leaving mine alone to clean their house. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It shifted. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask why. I simply did what any parent who finally sees the truth would do. And by the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. My name is Nathan Wolf, and this is the moment my whole life split into a before and an after. But before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. If my story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe. It helps this space grow, and it lets more people hear stories that should never be ignored. I used to believe that everything in life could be contained inside a structure that if I looked close enough at the numbers, the risks, the variables, I could always predict where the cracks would form before anything broke. That worked for me as a risk analyst. It just never worked for me as a son, or as a father. My name is Nathan Wolf, 31. And a few months ago, I found myself packing up my life in Phoenix and moving my daughter Lyra into my parents' old house in Flagstaff. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was what families did for each other. What I didn't admit, not even to myself, was how desperate I was. After the cutbacks at work, my job became a month-to-month question mark. My parents called more often, slipping their struggles into every conversation, the mortgage falling behind my mother's back pain. My father's hours getting cut. They didn't ask directly, but guilt doesn't need clear language. It just needs a moment of weakness. So I said yes. Just for a few months, I said. Just until I get back on my feet. Walking into that house for the first time in years was like stepping into a memory I never wanted. The air was cold, almost metallic, and the familiar smell of damp wood crawled straight under my skin. The house didn't change. The tension inside me did. My father Eldon moved through the hallway the same way he always had, quiet, thin-shouldered, fading into the walls as though apologizing for existing. My mother Marjorie greeted us with a smile so wide it felt rehearsed, a little too practiced, a little too bright for the dim light of the living room. Beside me, Lyra squeezed my hand until her knuckles turned white. She whispered that the house didn't feel like somewhere we would stay long. I told her she was just nervous. But the truth was, I felt it too. Something unwelcoming, something familiar. That first night over dinner, the imbalance appeared so casually it almost passed as normal. Harper, my cousin's daughter, who spent most days here, sat at her designated spot, complete with a matching set of pastel plates, a monogrammed napkin, and her own glass. Lyra was handed a faded plastic plate from an old set I didn't even remember. My mother excused it effortlessly, saying Harper had sensitivity issues and needed her own utensils. I let it slide. It was the first night. I wanted peace. I wanted time for the house to warm to us, or for us to warm to it. But after dinner, I heard something that cracked through every illusion I had tried to hold. Lyra, soft-voiced and hopeful, asked Harper if they could play together after dessert. Harper's response was sharp, instinctive, like a line she'd memorized. Grandma says I have to be careful because you're not really family. I stood in the hallway unseen, listening as my daughter absorbed a blow she didn't deserve. My mother's laughter floated in from the kitchen, light and careless. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't rush in to defend Lyra. I froze. A grown man with every tool to fight back, and all I did was freeze. Later that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was just an awkward start, a misunderstanding, anything except what it felt like the beginning of something dangerous. I knew the house wasn't safe for her. I just wasn't ready to admit it out loud. So I told myself what I had always told myself when things got too heavy: give it time. Just a little more time. Within the first weeks, whatever hope I'd had began dissolving slowly, quietly, the way rot eats into wood long before you see the damage. Lyra became smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way she moved through the house. She spoke less, laughed less, kept to the safest corners she could find. After school, she would sit cross-legged on the floor, folding origami cranes with meticulous focus, as if building her own tiny world was easier than staying in mine. When I asked her about school, she said the classrooms were loud but still felt cold. That word cold kept returning in my mind. It was the same word I would have used for the house. My mother began implementing rules that made no real sense but were presented as absolute truths. Lyra couldn't open the fridge after 7 because children lack discipline with food. She couldn't hang her drawings because paper ruins clean walls. She couldn't have a cookie because sugar makes hyper children unbearable. Harper, meanwhile, moved freely through every rule as though they weren't written for her. New toys arrived weekly. Meals were portioned to her liking. When she knocked over a vase, my mother turned to Lyra and sighed, "You really need to be more careful." Lyra apologized for something she didn't even touch. One night, I finally approached my mother. I tried to be calm. I tried to be diplomatic. I said I felt Lyra was being treated unfairly. My mother looked at me with a pitying smile and replied, "Harper is our blood. Lyra is just staying here for now." The sentence landed heavier than she knew. Or maybe exactly as heavy as she intended. I wanted to argue. Instead, I stepped back. I justified my silence by telling myself this wasn't the moment to start a war. But the moment found me anyway. A few days later, while picking up laundry in Lyra's room, I noticed a small box pushed deep beneath her bed. Inside were crumpled pieces of paper, each one bearing the same painful question in different handwriting. Would everyone be happier if I disappeared? My breath caught. When I confronted Lyra gently, she said it was just scribbling. Just pretend. Just nothing. Children don't write questions like that for no reason. Not long after, our neighbor Zoe Ramsey knocked on my door. She asked if Lyra was okay because she had seen her sitting alone on the front steps in the cold arms around her knees, staring at the driveway as though she was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. I hadn't known she'd been outside at all. That realization hit me like a warning siren. My daughter was slipping out of my line of sight, out of my protection, inside a house I had chosen. That night, lying awake again, I finally let myself acknowledge what had been tightening around us since the day we moved in. This wasn't discomfort. This wasn't adjustment. The house was not just cold, it was hostile. And Lyra wasn't just unhappy, she was hurting. Still, some part of me kept whispering that I could manage it if I tried harder, that things might get better if I stayed patient. It was the last time I would lie to myself so thoroughly. The danger wasn't coming. It was already here. Lyra began to fear going home in a way that no 9-year-old should. Every afternoon when I picked her up, she slowed her steps the closer we got to the front door, as if each foot forward required a negotiation with something she dreaded. When I asked what was wrong, she lowered her head and pressed her lips into a thin line. Silence became her answer more often than not, and that silence told me far more than any explanation could have. Then her teacher called. She said Lyra hardly spoke in class, that her energy seemed faded, that she sat alone during breaks folding paper cranes. I told her I would look into it, and I meant it, but deep down, I already knew what the real problem was. It was the same problem I kept pretending I could manage. At home, the tension took on new shapes. Harper continued to go after Lyra in small, relentless ways. She grabbed Lyra's origami and tore it, whining to my mother that Lyra had ruined her things. My mother barely listened before turning to my daughter and sending her to the corner to stand facing the wall like a child being corrected for a tantrum she never had. I came home late one evening and found Lyra sitting on her bed with swollen eyes, pressing her hands together as if she didn't know where else to place her hurt. She didn't cry when she saw me. She just looked down as if even her own emotions were something she might be punished for. My father Eldon watched all of this from the edges of rooms. Sometimes his gaze softened with guilt when Lyra passed by, but he never stepped forward. He never questioned my mother or corrected her or even attempted to intervene. I realized then that he knew exactly what was happening, but he feared disrupting the balance he had lived under for decades. His silence was not neutrality. It was surrender. One evening as I walked into the kitchen, I heard my mother's voice drifting from behind me. She spoke in a low, firm tone that carried the confidence of someone who believed she was completely right. She told Harper that Lyra needed to learn not to expect anything, that children who weren't truly part of a family didn't get the same privileges as those who were. Harper asked why I brought Lyra here if she wasn't supposed to belong. My mother replied that I had no other choice. The words hit me like something physical. It was a confession one she never intended me to hear, and it stripped away the last of the excuses I had been building to protect her in my mind. The emotional strain began taking shape in Lyra's sleep. She woke at night crying softly, repeating that she was scared she had done something wrong. I held her, assuring her she hadn't, but my reassurances felt fragile in a house where love had terms and conditions. One night I found her sitting on the floor of her room, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the soft glow of her desk light. Her small face looked washed out, almost gray. That image stayed with me long after she fell asleep, carving itself into a place inside me I could no longer ignore. By then I knew with absolute clarity that something monumental needed to change. I also knew I had allowed myself to be trapped by obligations that were never mine to carry. I told myself I needed more time to figure things out, but even that was a lie. What I needed was courage, and I was only starting to understand how much of it this situation would require. Still, I hesitated, and that hesitation was the last quiet moment before everything finally broke open. The week of Harper's birthday began with an uneasiness I couldn't shake. Lyra had grown quieter by the day, moving like she expected reprimand with every step. She flinched when she heard my mother's heels clicking down the hallway, as if her body reacted before her mind could process anything. The spark I had always seen in her eyes dimmed until it was barely there. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that children adapt, but what was happening to Lyra wasn't adjustment. It was erasure. My mother announced that Harper's birthday would be a grand event this year. She spent days planning, ordering balloons, decorations, a cake larger than anything Lyra had ever been given. In a brief moment of naive hope, I thought maybe this celebration could help Lyra feel included. But before I could even finish the thought, my mother looked at me and stated plainly that Lyra was not to interfere. She said the family needed to present a certain image and that Lyra would not help it. The bluntness of her words left no room for misinterpretation. She had already decided who counted. The day of the party arrived with loud music, the smell of frosting, the chatter of guests filling every room. Harper danced through crowds of children while Lyra stayed upstairs because she had been told not to come down. I stepped away from the noise at one point, feeling overwhelmed, and noticed movement on the stairs. Lyra sat halfway down, tucked behind the railing, watching the celebration through the gaps. When she realized I'd seen her, she tensed immediately and whispered that she wasn't allowed to be downstairs, that if she showed her face, Harper would cry and I would be embarrassed. Hearing her say that, hearing her repeat it so matter-of-factly, felt like something sharp passing through me. I confronted my mother right then. I told her that excluding Lyra was cruel, that she was part of this family whether she liked it or not. My mother stared at me as though I were the unreasonable one. She said Lyra needed to understand her place. She said Harper had a bond with the family that Lyra didn't. Her voice was calm, like she was stating the weather. I felt anger rise inside me, heavy and hot, but before I could respond, something else caught my attention. Among the plates and napkins and brightly colored treats on the table, I saw a small folded birthday card tucked beneath a tablecloth. Lyra's name was written on it in her delicate handwriting. It was hidden, deliberately placed where no one would find it. Nearby, Harper received the biggest slice of cake while a smaller, untouched piece sat forgotten on the counter, as though waiting for a child who had never truly been invited. It struck me then that this wasn't accidental. This wasn't oversight. This was intentional exclusion, woven into the fabric of the house like a rule that never needed to be spoken, because it was already understood. That night, after the guests left and the music faded, Lyra crawled onto my bed and asked in a trembling voice if she made everyone embarrassed. I pulled her into my arms, feeling the weight of her question settle over me like something irreversible. I knew then that whatever I had been trying to salvage between my parents and me had already collapsed. I had let things go too far. The harm wasn't subtle anymore. It had shape, depth, and consequence, and it was tearing into my daughter with every passing day. As she fell asleep against my chest, I finally admitted to myself that the quiet patience I had clung to wasn't protecting Lyra. It was hurting her. And the moment I acknowledged that truth, the path forward became painfully clear, even if I wasn't ready to walk it yet. The storm I had been sensing since the day we arrived was no longer approaching. It was already inside the house, closing in on us, and something in me was finally beginning to rise against it. After Harper's birthday, something in Lyra shifted in a way I could no longer explain away. She began withdrawing from the world with a quiet desperation that terrified me. Each morning she dragged her feet on the walk to school, and each afternoon she slowed down as we approached the front door, as if the house itself was something she feared stepping into. When I tried to talk to her, she stared at the floor and murmured that she didn't want to go back to school, didn't want to be anywhere she might mess up. The way she spoke, the way she carried herself felt wrong for a child who once lit up every room she entered. Then her teacher emailed again. She wrote that Lyra seemed disconnected, often spaced out and flinched when called on. She said Lyra sat alone during breaks and rarely interacted with anyone. Reading those words made something inside me tighten. I could no longer convince myself this was temporary. Something was happening to my daughter, and I had been too caught up in obligations to see the full scope of the damage. A few days later, Zoe called. She said she saw Lyra sitting alone on the front porch, hugging her knees, staring out into the cold like she was hiding or waiting for something to pass. I didn't even know Lyra had gone outside that evening. The thought that my daughter was finding places to disappear inside a home where I was supposed to protect her told me I had lost control of more than I realized. I tried to talk to my father that night. He stood in the kitchen rinsing a glass, shoulders curled inward like he was braced for something. I told him I was worried about Lyra, that something wasn't right. He kept his eyes fixed on the sink when he answered. He said softly that children needed to toughen up and that my mother was only trying to teach discipline. His voice betrayed something: hesitation, guilt, fear, but he didn't take it back. In that moment, I understood he wasn't blind. He was complicit by choosing not to act. One evening, I came home later than usual. As I walked down the hallway, I heard ripping sounds coming from the playroom. I stepped inside and found Harper tearing apart Lyra's origami cranes, small paper bodies scattered on the carpet. She looked up at me without guilt and said my mother told her she didn't need to keep anything that belonged to Lyra and that she was helping by getting rid of the mess. I felt anger rise in my chest, but before I could speak, she ran past me and disappeared into the living room. I found Lyra in her bedroom, curled up among shredded pieces of paper. She looked at me with tired eyes and whispered that she didn't want anyone to hate her anymore. She said she wished she could be invisible so no one would get upset. Hearing that from my child made the walls seem to close in. No discipline, no structure, no rule could justify a 9-year-old wanting to disappear. When I stepped into the hallway, I heard my mother's voice from the kitchen. She told my father that if I didn't learn to accept how things were, they would have to be firmer with Lyra so she understood her place in the family. I froze. It wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't tough love. It was intentional harm, and they justified it with a certainty that turned my stomach. By the time I went to bed that night, I knew the situation had escalated far beyond anything I had convinced myself I could navigate. Yet I still felt bound by guilt, by financial ties, by the idea that I owed my parents something. That conflict kept me rooted in place, even as everything inside me screamed to run. It was the final stretch of hesitation before the breaking point I didn't see coming but should have. When the Denver project came up, I almost turned it down. Leaving Lyra in Flagstaff felt wrong after everything I'd seen, but financially I had no choice. Before leaving, I pulled my mother aside and made it clear that Lyra wasn't to be given chores that were too difficult or punished for things she didn't do. My mother smiled tightly and told me not to worry. That smile had always bothered me, but this time it unsettled me more than usual. Right before I left, Lyra hugged me longer than she ever had, her small fingers digging into my jacket sleeve. She asked if she would be safe while I was gone. I wanted to promise her absolutely, but all I could do was reassure her with words that felt thinner than air. I left Flagstaff with a knot in my stomach, praying silently that I was imagining the worst. The first night in Denver, I called to check in. Lyra didn't answer. Instead, Harper picked up and said bluntly that Lyra wasn't allowed to talk because she was being punished. She didn't explain why. She didn't seem to think she needed to. My pulse spiked. I asked to speak to my mother, but the call ended before I could finish. I didn't sleep after that. I cut my trip short and drove through the night back to Flagstaff, every mile tightening my chest. I felt like I was racing something I couldn't yet see and losing. When I unlocked the front door, the house was silent in a way that felt wrong. No movement, no voices, not even the faint hum of anyone upstairs. The kitchen lights were off. The living room was empty. The back door was open just enough to let in a cold draft. I called Lyra's name once, twice louder each time. Nothing. For a moment, fear consumed me in a way I had never felt before. Then I walked into the kitchen. Lyra was on her knees scrubbing the floor with a rag so soaked it dripped onto her jeans. Her hands were red and raw. She didn't look up until I crouched beside her. She told me my mother said she made the house dirty and had to fix it. She said she wasn't allowed to eat until she finished. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't show confusion. They showed resignation, like she had already accepted this as her new normal. I asked where everyone else was. She said they had taken Harper to Valley Park and didn't want to be disturbed. They left my daughter alone in a house that wasn't her home, doing labor she shouldn't have to do while they went off to enjoy their day. The realization settled into me like ice. Then I saw the paper taped to the refrigerator. A chore chart that looked more like a punishment ledger written in my mother's handwriting. It listed every supposed mistake Lyra made, each one marked with a point deduction. At the bottom in large letters was a sentence telling children without discipline they didn't deserve privileges. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Everything inside me went still. I picked Lyra up, holding her against me while she trembled from fear and exhaustion. I took our documents from the drawer, grabbed our bags, and walked out the door. As I buckled her into the car, she asked if we were coming back. I told her no, not now, not ever. Before I started the engine, I went back inside long enough to leave a note on the kitchen counter. It was only one sentence, but it said everything that needed to be said. You left her alone. I won't let you do it again. We drove away without looking back. The house that had once been my childhood home faded into the darkness, and with it every excuse I had ever made for them. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that whatever it was, it had to be better than what we were leaving behind. Leaving the house that night felt nothing like moving out. It felt like escaping. Lyra clung to me in the car, her small hands trembling, her breath shallow and uneven. I knew then that what had been happening wasn't just family tension or generational differences. It was harm, deep, deliberate, repeated harm. I drove us straight to a small motel on the outskirts of Flagstaff, the kind of place where no one asks questions and the lights buzz faintly in the hallways. The moment we stepped inside, Lyra stood frozen until I turned on the overhead lamp. Only then did she finally let herself cry, and not the quiet kind. She sobbed from somewhere deep inside, as if releasing months of fear she'd never dared to voice. When she calmed enough to speak, her words came out in fragments, memories she had tucked away to survive. She told me that being left alone wasn't new. It had happened several times when my parents took Harper out because family needs time together. She repeated the things she had been told about not being blood, not belonging, being a disruption to the real future of the family. Every sentence was a cut I hadn't seen. Then she revealed something I had never heard before. One afternoon, Harper pushed her down the small staircase near the storage shed behind the house. Lyra tumbled onto the gravel, scraping her knees and bruising her ribs. My mother saw it happen. Instead of helping, she blamed Lyra for not being patient enough and told her to stop being dramatic. Hearing this made my entire body go cold. I had underestimated the danger clinging to the belief that endurance would protect us. Instead, it had enabled them. When Lyra fell asleep, I sat in the dim motel room for hours, staring at the peeling paint on the wall. I replayed every moment I had chosen silence, every excuse I had made for people who saw my daughter as a burden. I had failed her by thinking I could fix this family, that reason would soften something that was never meant to soften. That night, I stopped trying to manage the situation. I decided to end it. I acted quickly. I contacted the bank and halted all payments tied to the mortgage payments I had carried alone. Then I emailed my attorney asking to terminate any financial responsibility for the property. I gathered every scrap of evidence I had, the photos of Lyra's bruises, her notes, the audio recordings, the messages my mother sent. I documented everything. The next morning, I walked into the Flagstaff police station and filed a report for child endangerment and abandonment. The officer listened intently as I described what had happened, reminding me that under Arizona law, leaving a child alone for hours, especially one showing signs of emotional distress, was a crime. They opened a case immediately. I contacted CPS afterward. The intake worker kept me on the phone for nearly an hour as I described each incident, each shift in Lyra's behavior, each comment she had absorbed as truth. When I hung up, I felt something close to relief, not because this would be easy, but because I had finally stopped pretending this was tolerable. Later that evening, while Lyra and I sat on the edge of the motel bed eating takeout, my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. It was my mother. Her voice dripped with controlled rage as she told me I would regret turning against my own family, that I was exaggerating, that I was being manipulated by my own child. I recorded every word and sent it straight to the ongoing file. By the time I ended the call, I knew there was no returning to who I had been in that house, someone who tolerated and rationalized. The decision was made. The path was set. I looked over at Lyra sleeping, curled up on the blanket, finally breathing without fear. And I told myself a truth I should have recognized sooner. I could endure almost anything. But my daughter shouldn't have to endure any of it. Protecting her was no longer a choice. It was the only direction left. 2 days later, a CPS investigator named Rios arrived at the motel to meet with me and Lyra. He spoke gently, careful not to overwhelm her, but thorough enough to capture every detail. Lyra answered his questions quietly, but clearly describing the punishments, the isolation, the fear of doing anything wrong. Rios noted her hesitations, her flattened affect, the lingering signs of trauma. He assured us the case would be prioritized. Rios visited my parents' house the following day. As expected, my mother denied everything. She accused me of inventing a narrative to punish them for relying on my financial help. My father barely met Rios's gaze, his silence yet again revealing more than any defense could. Harper tried to explain that Lyra got punished when she messed up, but her answers dissolved when Rios asked what messing up meant. There was no structure, no fairness, only arbitrary cruelty. Rios then asked permission to review the home's exterior camera footage, reminding my parents they were legally obligated to cooperate. The recordings showed exactly what Lyra had said, multiple instances of her being left alone for hours, while the car pulled out of the driveway with only 3 passengers instead of 4. Each clip was a decisive indictment, clear evidence of neglect. Meanwhile, the financial fallout of my withdrawal hit swiftly. I received a notice that the house was being reviewed for foreclosure due to the halted mortgage payments. Instead of guilt, I felt something closer to clarity. That home had stopped being mine long before I stopped paying for it. CPS's initial findings were blunt. Lyra had been subjected to prolonged emotional harm, a hostile environment, and abandonment. As a result, my parents were temporarily barred from contacting her until the case concluded. Hearing this allowed me to breathe deeply for the first time in weeks. Predictably, my mother retaliated. She filed a claim accusing me of instability and unfitness as a parent. Her attempt collapsed quickly when I submitted counter-evidence letters from Lyra's teachers, medical notes, photos, recorded calls, police reports, and the footage Rios reviewed. The judge dismissed her claim within a day. Eldon refused to testify. Harper was referred for psychological evaluation due to concerns about learned behavior and emotional conditioning. Not long after, I accepted a stable job offer back in Phoenix. Lyra and I moved into a small apartment with soft morning light and a balcony overlooking a quiet courtyard. Lyra set up her origami station by the window and planted herbs in small ceramic pots. She laughed again, real laughter. This time asked questions about constellations and slowly stretched back into the child she had been before the house in Flagstaff drained her spirit. Sometimes at night while Lyra reads on the couch, I sit nearby and let the quiet settle around us. A peaceful quiet, not the suffocating one we used to live in. I think about how long I tried to make a broken structure hold, how I mistook endurance for responsibility. How I believed that family bonds required sacrifice even when the cost was my daughter's well-being. Now I know better. Some families exist only on paper. Others, like the one Lyra and I are building, are formed through choice protection and love, not shared blood or forced loyalty. In the final lines of my story, I understand something simple and absolute. Loving my daughter never meant staying silent. It meant standing between her and anything that threatened her light. And now finally we are free. When I look back now, it still amazes me how quietly a life can break, and how quietly it can begin again. There was no dramatic ending, no shattering revelation that came with thunder or fire. It was just a man standing in a motel room holding his trembling daughter, realizing the world he thought he had to tolerate was the very world he needed to walk away from. Sometimes the most powerful decisions are the ones we make in silence, not because we are weak, but because the truth finally becomes undeniable. In the weeks after moving to Phoenix, I began to understand that healing doesn't come in sweeping moments. It comes in tiny ones. The morning sunlight on Lyra's face as she waters her plants. The sound of her humming while folding paper cranes. The nights when she falls asleep without jerking awake from nightmares. Her voice when she first said, "I feel safe now," soft but steady, as if she didn't fully trust the words yet, but she wanted to. I've learned something I should have known a long time ago. Safety isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of someone who protects you, someone who chooses you, someone who sees you as enough. I used to think family was an unbreakable structure defined by blood and duty. Now I know it's something you build brick by brick with the people who treat your heart as something worth safeguarding. There are still nights when doubt creeps in. Nights when I wonder whether I should have fought harder sooner. But then Lyra will hand me a new origami figure, or curl up next to me on the couch, or ask me to show her where Orion is in the night sky, and the guilt loosens its grip. We survived something that wanted to shape us into silence. And instead, we found our voices. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know whether the pain of that house will ever disappear completely. But I do know this: we're not living under someone else's shadow anymore. The space that once felt so small and suffocating has opened into something wide and breathable. A life where Lyra gets to grow instead of shrink. A life where I finally learned that being a good father isn't about enduring, it's about choosing courage at the precise moment your child needs it most. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Truly. Sharing something this raw isn't easy, but knowing someone is listening makes the weight a little lighter. Before you go, I'd love to know you're here with me. Tell me where you're watching from, or what the sky looks like outside your window tonight. Connection, even in small ways, reminds us that none of us walk through the hard parts alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about struggle, mistakes, healing, and the quiet victories that don't always make noise, feel free to subscribe. It helps this space grow, and it helps me keep telling the truths that so often stay unspoken. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for giving this story a place to land.